The rain fell in gentle waves, a soothing rhythm against the glass of the conservatory. Each droplet traced a lazy path down the pane, pooling momentarily before slipping away. Daniel leaned closer, his breath fogging the surface. He drew back, the blurred outline of his reflection staring back at him, tired, distant, and unmoored. Across the room, Margaret, his stepmother of 15 years, was adjusting the clasp of a pearl necklace. Her movements were precise, deliberate, each motion betraying a lifetime of practiced elegance. The room was bathed in the soft amber glow of the antique chandelier above, its light catching the delicate strands of her necklace as they settled against her collarbone. Margaret's eyes met his through the faintly tarnished mirror. A smile touched her lips, subtle yet familiar. It was a smile that had always seemed to hold more than it revealed, warm, genuine, but tinged with something distant, almost imperceptible. "It's nice to have you home," she said, breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around the room like a thick shawl since dinner. Her voice was calm, even soothing, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something heavy. "The house feels fuller." Daniel turned toward her, his arms crossing almost defensively. He managed a small, polite smile in return. "It's strange being back. Everything feels smaller than I remember." Margaret's soft laugh filled the room, a gentle echo against the steady rhythm of the rain. "That's what growing up does," she replied, tilting her head slightly as if considering her own words. "The world shrinks and memories grow larger." Daniel nodded faintly, his gaze drifting to the darkened corners of the room. The conservatory was just as he remembered, filled with ferns and ivy that seemed to thrive under her care, their shadows dancing faintly on the tiled floor as lightning flickered outside. Yet the house, so vibrant in his childhood memories, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. 6 weeks had passed since his father's death, and in that time, the house had become a mausoleum. Each step he took seemed to stir ghosts from the creaking floorboards, faint echoes of laughter and arguments that felt more like half-remembered dreams. The past lingered here, in every corner and every detail, but nowhere more profoundly than in Margaret herself. She moved to set down the jewelry box, her hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Her movements were deliberate, as if she was buying herself time to gather words that didn't come easily. Her gaze lingered on him again, her lips parting slightly before she spoke. "Have you been sleeping?" Daniel blinked, startled by the softness of her question. He brushed a hand through his unruly dark hair, the gesture as much to stall as to respond. "As much as anyone does after." His voice faltered, the weight of the unspoken words settling in the air between them. Margaret nodded, stepping closer. The distance between them narrowed, but it remained charged, as though neither quite knew how to cross the invisible line drawn by grief. Her steps were careful, her silk robe rustling faintly as she moved. "I miss him too," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I keep telling myself he wouldn't want us drowning in grief. He'd want us to find a way forward." Daniel's eyes flicked to her face, and he was struck by how composed she seemed. Yet there was a shimmer in her eyes, the barest trace of unshed tears that caught the light. For all her poise, her strength, there was no hiding the fragility beneath it. He realized then how rarely he had seen her cry, not at the funeral, not during the endless procession of condolences, not even when they had returned home to an empty house. "You're stronger than I am," he said, attempting a half-hearted joke, though the sincerity in his tone betrayed him. Margaret smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Strength is overrated," she replied, a hint of bitterness lacing her words. "Sometimes it's just a mask." Her words hung in the air, and Daniel felt the weight of them settle into his chest. He wanted to respond, to reach for some comforting platitude, but none came. Instead, he let the silence fill the space between them, as it always did in moments like these. The sound of the rain against the glass grew heavier, each drop amplified by the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a low, steady growl that vibrated through the walls. Margaret glanced toward the window, her fingers idly brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I should let you rest," she said finally, though she made no move to leave. Daniel hesitated, his own words caught in his throat. "I'm not tired," he admitted, his voice quieter now. Margaret studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Neither am I," she said. For a moment they simply stood there, the storm outside providing the only sound. And then, without another word, Margaret turned and left the room, leaving Daniel alone with the rain and the weight of everything they hadn't said. The storm had worsened by the time Daniel found himself wandering the darkened halls of the house. Lightning illuminated the familiar yet foreign space in flashes, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with each rumble of thunder. He stopped in front of the study, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he stepped inside, the scent of old leather and aged paper enveloping him immediately. The room was just as his father had left it, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, the heavy oak desk dominating the center, and the faint smell of cigar smoke lingering in the air. On the desk sat a stack of letters, their edges yellowed with time. Daniel's eyes were drawn to them, and before he knew it, his hand was reaching out. His fingers brushed the topmost envelope, the one addressed in his father's neat, measured script, Margaret. He hesitated, his heart thudding unevenly in his chest. What secrets had his father left behind? And what right did he have to uncover them? Couldn't sleep? Margaret's voice broke the silence, startling him. Daniel turned sharply to find her standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the hallway light. She had changed into a robe, loosely belted, her hair uncharacteristically undone. She looked different, softer somehow, as though the storm outside had seeped into her, loosening the edges of her carefully maintained composure. "Not really," he admitted, holding up the letter. "I found these." Her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, then something more guarded. She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. "I haven't had the courage to go through them yet," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the letters. Daniel hesitated, searching her face for some hint of permission. "Do you want to?" Margaret crossed to the desk with deliberate grace, her movements slow but steady. For a moment they stood shoulder to shoulder, both staring at the letters as if they might explode. "You can read it," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. Daniel unfolded the letter, the paper creasing under his trembling hands. The ink had bled slightly in places, the product of age or a heavier hand pressing down too hard in moments of emotion. The opening line was simple, unassuming, but it caught Daniel like a hook. "My dearest Margaret," it began, the words carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room like a shroud. Daniel's throat tightened as he read on, the words pulling him into a side of his father he had never truly known. The letter was a confession, not of guilt or wrongdoing, but of fear, of inadequacy, of a love that had shaped his life, but also bound him in ways he didn't fully understand. "I've always envied your strength, even as I leaned on it. You make the unbearable seem manageable, the impossible somehow less daunting. But there are moments when I see the cracks, Margaret. Moments when I know you're carrying more than anyone should. And it terrifies me that I can't take that weight from you." Daniel stopped, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper as if it might slip away. His father's voice seemed to echo in his mind, the same steady cadence he remembered from childhood, but tinged now with vulnerability. Margaret had moved to the window, her back to him. The faint outline of her reflection shimmered in the glass, her posture rigid despite the storm raging outside. "He wrote this not long after you left for college," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I remember finding him in here, staring at that desk for hours, pen in hand. He said he wanted to write everything down, to leave behind a record of who he was. Just in case." Daniel's gaze flicked to her, then back to the letter. "I've made mistakes. So many mistakes. But loving you was never one of them. You've given me more than I deserve, and I fear I've taken more than I've earned. If the time ever comes when I can't say these things to you, I hope this letter finds you and reminds you of everything I should have said but didn't." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of the words pressing against his chest. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the desk as though it were something fragile. Margaret turned to face him, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. Her hair framed her face in soft waves, and for the first time, Daniel saw the exhaustion etched into her features. "He always did have a way with words," she said, her lips curving into a faint, bittersweet smile. "But sometimes I wonder if he ever really knew how to say them aloud." Daniel nodded, his own voice caught somewhere between his mind and throat. "I didn't know he felt like that. About himself, about you." Margaret stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the rug. "There was a part of him he kept from everyone," she said. "Even me. But it wasn't because he didn't love us. It was because he loved us too much to show us the parts of himself he couldn't bear." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with shared grief and understanding. The storm outside had become a distant hum, the rain no longer a backdrop, but a rhythm that matched the tension between them. "You don't have to carry that same weight," Margaret said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. "You're not him, Daniel. You don't have to live in his shadow." Her words struck a chord deep within him, unraveling something he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. I don't know who I'm supposed to be without him. Margaret's gaze softened, her hand lifting as if to reach for him before falling back to her side. You're supposed to be yourself, she said. Whoever that is, whoever you want to be. The vulnerability in her voice mirrored his own, and for a moment, the distance between them felt insurmountable. But then Margaret stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm lightly, hesitantly. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark of something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I wish he could have said these things to you, Margaret murmured. I wish I could have said them to him, Daniel admitted, his voice trembling. Margaret's hand lingered, her touch a tether pulling him back from the edge of his thoughts. You can say them to me, she said, her words barely audible but filled with conviction. Daniel's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The weight of everything they had shared, everything they hadn't said, pressed down on them like the storm clouds outside. And in that moment, Daniel felt something shift, something fragile but undeniable. The night stretched on as they sat together in the study, the letters between them a bridge to a past they were both trying to make sense of. The storm began to wane, the rain softening into a gentle patter that mirrored the quiet understanding growing between them. When dawn broke, its light filtering through the curtains in soft, golden hues, Margaret leaned back in the chair, her exhaustion palpable. Her eyes fluttered closed, her head resting against the backrest as her breathing slowed. Daniel watched her for a moment, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders, but tempered by the strange, tentative connection that had formed between them. Thank you, she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see him. For what? For staying, she said simply, her words carrying more than just gratitude. As her breathing deepened, Daniel felt a sense of calm settle over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running from his father, from himself, from the weight of expectations he could never quite meet. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light over the house and the two of them, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time. He felt like he was finally home. The hours blended into a haze of shared silence and whispered revelations. Daniel had lost track of time, his mind too occupied with the weight of their conversation and the unspoken emotions that lingered in the air. Margaret stirred from her light doze, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone trying to reorient themselves in the waking world. The golden light of dawn painted her features, softening the sharp edges of her usual composure. For a moment, she looked younger, less the poised, measured woman he'd known all his life, and more like someone unguarded, vulnerable. Good morning, she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. Her eyes met his, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. Have you been up this whole time? Daniel shrugged, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders. I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to leave you alone. Margaret's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. You've always had that protective streak, she said, her tone carrying a mix of affection and sadness. Even as a boy, you were always trying to take care of everyone, even when it wasn't your responsibility. Her words brought a faint heat to his cheeks, though he wasn't entirely sure why. I guess I never really grew out of it, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Margaret stood, stretching slightly before crossing to the window. The storm had left the world glistening, the garden shimmering with raindrops that clung to every leaf and petal. It's a beautiful morning, she said, more to herself than to him. Daniel rose, joining her at the window. The warmth of her proximity sent a subtle jolt through him, a reminder of how closely they'd been drawn together in the past few hours. His gaze followed hers, taking in the familiar view of the garden his father had meticulously cared for, a legacy now left in Margaret's hands. He used to spend hours out there, Daniel said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Sometimes I'd watch him from this very spot, wondering what he was thinking about. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. He found peace in the garden. It was his way of making sense of the chaos in his mind. Daniel glanced at her, noting the way her fingers lightly traced the edge of the window pane. What about you? He asked. What helps you make sense of the chaos? Margaret's hand stilled, her gaze distant. I'm not sure I ever figured that out, she admitted. Your father had the garden, his letters, his books. I suppose I just learned to live with it. Her vulnerability caught him off guard, like a sudden shift in the wind. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort or understanding, but the words didn't come. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing hers as it rested against the window. The contact was brief but electric, an unspoken acknowledgement of the closeness that had grown between them. Margaret's eyes flicked to his, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. You don't have to carry it alone, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. Margaret's expression softened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that laced it. That means more than you know. The moment stretched, the silence between them filled with the unspoken. The sunlight shifted, casting a warm glow over their faces as they stood there, connected by a shared grief and a bond that felt deeper than either of them could fully comprehend. I should make breakfast, Margaret said suddenly, stepping back and breaking the spell. Her movements were deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though she needed the routine to anchor herself. Daniel nodded, though a part of him ached at the loss of the moment. I'll help, he offered, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. The kitchen was filled with the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and sizzling eggs. They worked together in a comfortable rhythm, their conversation light but meaningful. Margaret seemed more at ease, her laughter coming more easily, and Daniel found himself smiling in a way that felt almost foreign. As they sat down to eat, the weight of the previous night lingered in the air, but it was tempered by the warmth of their shared meal. They didn't need to speak of what had passed between them, it was understood, a thread woven into the fabric of their relationship. After breakfast, Margaret suggested a walk through the garden. The air was crisp and fresh, the scent of rain and earth mingling in a way that was both invigorating and calming. They strolled in companionable silence, their steps crunching softly against the gravel paths. I've been meaning to ask, Margaret said after a while, her voice thoughtful. What are you planning to do now that you're back? Daniel hesitated, his gaze fixed on a cluster of blooming roses. I'm not sure, he admitted. Everything feels uncertain. Margaret stopped, turning to face him. That's okay, she said, her eyes searching his. It's okay to not have all the answers right now. Her words were a balm to his restless mind, a reminder that he didn't need to have it all figured out. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. As the day wore on, they fell into an easy rhythm, their shared presence a comfort to both of them. The house, once heavy with memories and silence, seemed lighter somehow, as though their connection had breathed new life into its walls. And though neither of them spoke of the tension that simmered beneath the surface, it remained a quiet, unspoken thing that neither could fully ignore. The late afternoon sun slanted through the conservatory windows, casting long streaks of gold across the worn rug. Daniel sat in his father's favorite armchair, a book open in his lap though his eyes weren't on the page. Margaret sat nearby, her hands cradling a cup of tea, her posture relaxed but her gaze far away. Do you ever think about leaving this house? Daniel asked, breaking the silence. His voice was careful, testing the waters of a question that had lingered in his mind. Margaret's gaze snapped to his, startled but steady. Sometimes, she admitted. But this place. It holds so much of him. Of us. Her voice softened. And now of you. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I always thought it was his house. I guess I never realized how much of you is in it, too. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. I've poured a lot of myself into this home, it's true. But there are parts of me here that even I don't recognize anymore. Her words hung in the air, filling the space between them. Daniel wanted to reach for her, to offer reassurance, but the weight of the moment held him still. Do you regret staying? He asked after a pause. Margaret's smile faltered, her gaze dropping to the teacup in her hands. Sometimes, she said, her voice barely audible. But staying gave me you. And that's something I'll never regret. The sincerity in her words sent a jolt through him, a warmth that spread through his chest and left him momentarily speechless. He searched her face, looking for answers to questions he wasn't sure he was ready to ask. He began, then hesitated. The words felt too heavy, too much. Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting his. What is it? Daniel shook his head, forcing a small smile. Nothing. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the way her presence filled the room, the way her gaze lingered on him a second too long, the way the house seemed to shrink around them, drawing them closer together. As evening fell, they found themselves back in the study, the room where so many of their revelations had taken place. The letters sat untouched on the desk, their contents too raw to revisit just yet. Margaret moved to the window, her silhouette framed by the last light of the day. You're quiet tonight, she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. Daniel shrugged, leaning against the desk. Just thinking. About what? About you, he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Margaret turned, her expression unreadable. Me? You've done so much for this family, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. For him. For me. I don't think I've ever told you how much I admire you for that. Her breath hitched, and she took a step closer. You don't have to say that, Daniel. But I do, he insisted. Because it's true. The air between them grew heavy, charged with an energy that neither of them fully understood, but both felt acutely. Margaret's eyes searched his, her expression softening. You've always had a way of seeing people, she said quietly. Of understanding them, even when they don't understand themselves. Daniel took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Maybe that's because you taught me how. Margaret's lips parted, as though she wanted to respond, but no words came. The moment stretched, the tension between them thick and undeniable. Daniel, she began, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers lightly, hesitantly. The contact was electric, sending a shiver through him that he couldn't ignore. You're not alone, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Margaret's hand trembled under his touch, her gaze locked on his. I know, she said, her voice breaking. But sometimes it feels easier to pretend I can. You don't have to pretend with me, Daniel said, his tone firm but gentle. The distance between them disappeared, and for a moment they simply stood there, the world outside the study fading into irrelevance. The unspoken emotions that had been building for weeks, months, perhaps even years, finally surfaced, raw and unfiltered. Margaret took a shaky breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. For reminding me. Daniel nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. You've always been there for me. Let me be here for you. As the storm outside picked up again, its rhythm a counterpoint to their quiet connection, Daniel and Margaret sat down together, the weight of their shared history and unspoken bond filling the room. The letters on the desk remained untouched, but they no longer needed them. The answers they sought were not in the words left behind, but in the understanding that had grown between them. And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall, they found solace in each other, a fragile but unbreakable connection that would carry them through the storms yet to come. The conservatory had grown dimmer as the storm clouds thickened outside. The rain was heavier now, an insistent drumbeat against the glass panes. Daniel could feel its vibration in the soles of his feet, grounding him in the present even as his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He had spent hours in this room as a boy, sprawled on the chaise with a book while his father worked and Margaret read beside him, her soft presence as much a part of the space as the sunlight that used to stream through the ivy-covered windows. But now, in the quiet tension of the evening, the room felt transformed. Margaret moved about the space, adjusting small details with absent hands, straightening a picture frame, smoothing the edge of a throw pillow. She didn't look at him, but Daniel felt her awareness of him, a quiet thread that connected them across the room. You always loved this place, she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of something deeper. Daniel leaned back in the chair, his hands resting on the arms as he studied her. I think it's because it was the one room where everything seemed still, like time didn't touch it. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. Your father said the same thing once. He called it our sanctuary. There it was again, his father. An omnipresent shadow in their lives, even now that he was gone. Daniel shifted in his seat, the weight of the past pressing heavily on his chest. It doesn't feel the same without him, he said, his voice quieter now. Nothing does. Margaret paused, her hand hovering over the edge of the mantel. She turned to face him fully, her expression soft but unreadable. No, it doesn't. But that doesn't mean it can't still be a sanctuary. For us. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For us. Daniel's throat tightened as he studied her, the way her gaze lingered on him, open and searching. He wondered if she could feel the tension between them as acutely as he did, a tension that had grown since his return home, unacknowledged but undeniable. You've always been good at finding the right words, he said, his tone lighter than he felt. Even when no one else could. Margaret's smile widened, but there was a sadness in it. Words are easy. It's what we don't say that's hard. Daniel's breath caught, the truth of her statement hitting too close. He stood abruptly, his hands finding the back of the chair as he looked out the rain-soaked windows. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the storm within him, a chaos he couldn't name but felt all the same. I'm sorry, he said finally, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. For leaving? For not coming back sooner? For the way his presence seemed to stir things between them that neither could explain? Margaret moved closer, her footsteps soft against the carpet. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. You don't have to be sorry, Daniel. You've done nothing wrong. Her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through him. He turned to face her, and the look in her eyes nearly undid him. It wasn't just kindness or understanding, it was something deeper, something that made his pulse quicken and his thoughts spiral. I don't know what I'm doing here, he admitted, his voice breaking. I don't know how to be here without him. Margaret stepped closer, her hand lingering just above his. You're here because you're meant to be. Because this is still your home. Her words were like an anchor, grounding him in the moment. Daniel felt his resolve falter, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on him. He looked into her eyes, searching for answers he wasn't sure he was ready to find. You've always been there, he said, his voice low. Through everything. I don't think I ever thanked you for that. Margaret's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she reached up, her hand brushing his cheek with a tenderness that made his chest ache. The gesture was brief, almost hesitant, but it left a warmth that lingered long after her hand fell away. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. For coming home. Daniel swallowed hard, his emotions too tangled to put into words. He stepped back, breaking the moment before it could deepen further. I should get some sleep. Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable once more. Good night, Daniel. Good night, he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. As he left the room, the storm outside seemed to intensify, its fury echoing the turmoil within him. Daniel knew he wouldn't sleep that night. There were too many questions, too many feelings he couldn't name. But as he climbed the stairs, he couldn't shake the memory of her touch, the way her eyes had held his like they were seeing him for the first time. The storm stretched through the night, a relentless rhythm of rain and wind that seemed to seep into the walls of the old house. Daniel lay awake in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling as shadows flickered across it. The faint scent of cedar from the wardrobe mingled with the damp chill of the storm, grounding him in the familiarity of a space that no longer felt entirely his. He turned onto his side, eyes catching on the small photograph propped on the nightstand. It was from a family trip years ago, Margaret laughing in the sunlight, his father's arm slung casually over her shoulder, and Daniel caught mid-grin, holding a fishing pole with far too much confidence for someone who had never caught a fish. The image felt like a relic from another life, one that had slipped through his fingers without him noticing. The faint creak of a door opening broke his thoughts. He sat up, listening. Footsteps. Light, deliberate. Heading toward the study. Curiosity tugged at him. He slipped out of bed, the cool wooden floor pressing against his bare feet as he padded into the hallway. The house was dark, the storm outside providing the only light in brief, jagged flashes. He followed the sound, careful to avoid the familiar spots in the floor that groaned under weight. The study door was ajar, a thin line of golden light spilling into the hallway. He paused outside, hesitating before pushing it open slightly. Margaret sat at the desk, the same pile of letters spread before her. She wasn't reading them, though. Her head rested in her hands, her hair falling like a curtain around her face. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, as if the weight of the house and its memories had finally settled squarely on her shoulders. Margaret, he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up sharply, her eyes wide and shimmering in the dim light. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she straightened, brushing her hair back with a quick motion. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, her tone light but forced. Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I heard something and I wanted to check. Margaret offered a small, weary smile. Just me wrestling with ghosts. His gaze dropped to the letters. I couldn't stop thinking about them. What he wrote. It felt different than I expected. She nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of one envelope. He was always better with words on paper than in person. I think he knew that. Daniel leaned against the edge of the desk, his proximity drawing her attention. Did he ever talk to you about me? About how he felt? Margaret hesitated, her eyes searching his face. He loved you, Daniel. Fiercely. But I think he struggled to show it in ways you could understand. Daniel swallowed, the weight of her words settling over him. I always thought he was disappointed, that I wasn't what he wanted me to be. Margaret reached out then, her hand brushing his arm. The touch was light but steady, a gesture meant to anchor him. He wasn't disappointed. He just didn't know how to let go of his own expectations. That wasn't your failure. It was his. Her words hit him like a wave, both freeing and devastating. He looked down at her hand on his arm, the warmth of her touch grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. When he met her gaze, the intensity there made his pulse quicken. "You always seem to understand him better than I did," he said, his voice low. "I understood him," she replied, her hand falling away slowly. "But that doesn't mean it was easy. Or enough." The room felt smaller, the air charged with something unspoken. Daniel's eyes lingered on her, the lines of her face softened by the warm light of the desk lamp. She looked tired, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to seeing. It stirred something in him, an urge to reach out, to offer comfort in the only way he knew how. "Margaret," he began, his voice trembling slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "Yes." He hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I don't know how to do this. Any of it." Her expression softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Neither do I," she admitted. "But we don't have to figure it out all at once." Daniel nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The storm outside had eased, the rain now a gentle patter against the windows. It felt like a lull, a moment of calm after the chaos. "Stay," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" "Stay here," she repeated, her eyes fixed on his. "Just for a little while. Easier. With someone else." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before moving to the chair opposite hers. He sat down, the tension in his chest loosening as the quiet between them settled into something more comfortable. Margaret picked up one of the letters, her fingers brushing the edges as she read silently. They didn't speak for the rest of the night, but they didn't need to. The storm outside continued its gentle rhythm, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the weight of his grief lift, just slightly, in the shared silence of the study. The storm waned into a steady drizzle as dawn crept through the cracks of the old house. The warm amber light softened the sharp edges of the study, illuminating the lingering haze of tension and unspoken words. Daniel shifted in his chair, the creak of the leather breaking the stillness. Across the desk, Margaret sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the letter in her hand, though it was clear her thoughts were elsewhere. He studied her face, now lit by the hesitant glow of morning. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes seemed deeper, her expression etched with a quiet vulnerability he wasn't accustomed to seeing. In that moment, she looked less like the composed, untouchable figure he'd known, and more like someone who bore the same weight of grief and confusion as he did. "Do you think it ever gets easier?" Daniel asked softly, his voice hoarse from the hours of silence. Margaret blinked, as if startled out of her reverie. She placed the letter down carefully and looked at him, her expression contemplative. "Not easier," she said after a pause. "Just different. The sharp edges dull, but they never truly go away." He nodded, her words resonating deeply. "It feels like he's still here sometimes. Like I'll turn a corner and see him, sitting at that desk or pacing the hall." Margaret smiled faintly, a bittersweet curve of her lips. "He had a way of filling a space, didn't he? Even in silence." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you ever think he kept too much to himself? That there were things he wanted to say but couldn't?" Her eyes searched his face, a flicker of something unspoken passing through her expression. "I think he believed silence was a form of strength. But strength doesn't always serve us well, especially when it keeps us from connecting with the people we love." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Daniel felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He had spent so much time resenting his father's distance, his inability to express his emotions, that he had failed to see the ways he was replicating that same behavior now, with Margaret, with himself. "I don't want to be like that," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't want to hold things in until it's too late." Margaret's gaze softened, and she reached across the desk, her hand hesitating before it landed on his. The touch was light but grounding, her fingers curling just slightly against his. "Then don't," she said simply. "Say what you need to say. To me, to yourself, to whoever needs to hear it." Her touch sent a jolt through him, not shocking but warm, steady, alive. He looked at their hands, the contact small but significant. "It's not always that easy," he murmured. "No," she agreed, her voice gentle. "But the hardest things are often the most necessary." The faint sound of birdsong filtered in through the rain, a reminder that the world outside continued to turn, indifferent to their grief and introspection. Daniel pulled his hand away slowly, the absence of her touch leaving a strange ache in its wake. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "For being here." For everything. Margaret smiled again, a little more genuinely this time. You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, remember? He nodded, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the soft sounds of the house waking around them. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a faint glimmer of hope, fragile, but present, amid the weight of loss. The rain continued its rhythmic dance against the glass, a gentle percussion that echoed the quiet heartbeat of the house. Daniel rose from the chair and moved to the window, his hands sliding into his pockets as he stared out at the garden. The storm had softened the earth, leaving the once pristine flower beds speckled with fallen leaves and overturned petals. It reminded him of how delicate things could be, how easily the carefully constructed facades of life could be undone by forces beyond control. Margaret stood and followed, stopping just a few feet behind him. He could sense her presence without turning, the subtle weight of her gaze resting on him like a question unasked. "Do you remember when he planted those roses?" she asked softly, her voice weaving through the stillness. He insisted on doing it himself, even though the gardener told him it was the wrong season. Daniel let a faint smile tug at his lips. He said they'd be stronger for it, that adversity made things grow deeper roots. He always did see the world in metaphors, Margaret said, her tone carrying the warmth of nostalgia mixed with the ache of loss. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Those roses are still thriving against all odds. He glanced at her reflection in the glass. Her arms were crossed loosely, her fingers brushing the silk fabric of her robe. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, a departure from the usual meticulous style she favored. She looked softer somehow, less the poised matriarch and more the woman who had stood beside his father through decades of triumphs and trials. "You two balanced each other," Daniel said, his words surprising even himself. He was all about strength and structure. "You brought grace." Margaret tilted her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Grace," she repeated as if testing the word. "I suppose that was my role, wasn't it? To smooth the rough edges, to soften the blows." Her gaze drifted past him to the garden, and for a moment, it felt as though she wasn't speaking to him at all. "But sometimes I wonder if I made it too easy for him. If I should have pushed harder, asked for more." Daniel turned to face her, the vulnerability in her voice drawing him closer. "More of what?" "Honesty," she said simply. "Connection. There were times when I felt like I was standing in the shadow of a man who couldn't bear to be fully seen." Her words resonated with a truth he hadn't wanted to confront, that his father's inability to open up had created a chasm not just in their family, but within himself. And yet Margaret had stayed, weathering the storms with a quiet resilience that he both admired and envied. "You deserved more," he said quietly. She met his eyes then, her expression unreadable but intense. "We all did, but he gave what he could, and in his own way he loved us." The air between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of shared understanding. Daniel took a step closer, his voice steady but filled with an urgency he couldn't quite name. "You've always been the strongest person I know, Margaret. Even now you're holding everything together while I—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I feel like I'm falling apart." Her hand reached out instinctively, brushing his arm in a gesture of comfort. "You're not falling apart, Daniel. You're grieving. There's a difference." "But you're not," he said, searching her face. "At least, it doesn't seem like you are. How do you do it?" She exhaled softly, her fingers lingering for a moment before dropping to her side. "I grieve in private. Always have. It's easier to carry the weight when no one's watching." Her confession struck him like a jolt, peeling back another layer of the woman he thought he knew. He realized then how little he had truly seen of her beyond the roles she played: stepmother, wife, caretaker. There was a person beneath all of that, someone with her own fears, regrets, and desires. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not with me." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. The tension tightened, an invisible thread pulling them closer, even as the boundaries of their relationship threatened to hold them apart. "Daniel," she began, her tone cautious, almost pleading. But whatever she was about to say was swallowed by the moment, by the storm inside both of them that refused to be silenced. The sound of a door creaking down the hall broke the spell, reminding them of where they were, of who they were. Margaret stepped back, her composure returning like a mask slipping into place. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice steady but distant. "It's been a long night." Daniel nodded, the weight of everything unsaid settling heavily in his chest. "Good night, Margaret." Good night, Daniel. As she left the room, he turned back to the window, his reflection a ghost staring back at him. The garden outside was still drenched in rain, the roses resilient despite the storm. And for the first time, he wondered if he had more of his father in him than he'd ever cared to admit. But unlike his father, Daniel vowed he wouldn't let silence define him. Not anymore. The rain continued its ceaseless rhythm through the night, weaving its melody into the quiet stillness of the study. Daniel stayed awake long after Margaret had dozed off, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the soft candlelight. The stack of letters sat between them, a fragile bridge between past and present, while the storm outside mirrored the unrest within. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, her hair falling over her face. Her vulnerability in that moment struck him. The elegance she always carried had given way to something unguarded, something real. For years, she had been a distant figure of grace and composure, but tonight she felt closer, tethered to him by shared grief and unspoken truths. Daniel's gaze drifted to her hand, resting lightly on the armrest of her chair. Without thinking, he reached over and gently tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, catching his hand mid-motion. For a moment, neither moved, caught in the stillness between them. "I didn't mean to wake you," Daniel murmured, his voice low. Margaret shook her head, blinking away the haze of sleep. "I wasn't really asleep. Just resting my eyes." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You should sleep too. You've barely rested since you got here." Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting out a quiet sigh. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm back in his shadow." Margaret tilted her head, studying him. "You've always thought of it that way, haven't you? Like you had to live up to something unreachable." "He made it unreachable," Daniel admitted, his tone edged with frustration. "He had this way of making everything about expectations, about what I should be. I don't think he ever saw me for who I actually was." Margaret's expression softened, and she leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "He saw you, Daniel. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but he did. He just didn't know how to say it." Daniel searched her face, his chest tightening at the sincerity in her voice. "And you? Did you see me?" Her hand lingered a moment longer before she pulled it back. "I always did. But it wasn't my place to interfere, not with how he was." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The intimacy of the moment unnerved him, but it also drew him closer, like a moth to a flame. He wanted to ask her more, to unravel the layers of mystery that surrounded her, but a part of him held back, afraid of what he might find. "I think I should get some air," Daniel said abruptly, rising from his chair. The confined space of the study felt suffocating, the weight of the letters and their conversation pressing down on him. Margaret nodded, her gaze following him as he moved toward the door. "Be careful. The storm hasn't let up yet." "I'll be fine," he assured her, grabbing his coat from the hallway. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the rain soaking through his clothes almost instantly. The storm had softened to a drizzle, the wind carrying the faint scent of wet earth and lavender from the garden. The garden had always been Margaret's sanctuary. Even in the early years of their blended family, when tensions ran high, she had poured her energy into the flower beds and trellises. Now, in the muted light of the storm, the garden felt alive, wild and untamed in a way that mirrored his emotions. Daniel wandered through the rows of roses and ivy, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He replayed their conversation, her touch, the look in her eyes when she spoke of his father. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that felt both dangerous and magnetic. He stopped in front of the climbing roses, their blooms heavy with rain. The scent was intoxicating, a blend of sweetness and earthiness that grounded him in the present moment. He closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him, as if it could cleanse the confusion that clouded his thoughts. "Couldn't sleep either?" Margaret's voice broke through the quiet, and he turned to see her standing at the edge of the garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked ethereal in the moonlight, her hair damp from the rain and her bare feet sinking slightly into the muddy path. "I needed to clear my head," Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret stepped closer, her presence as steadying as the rain. "I know the feeling. This house has a way of holding on to things, doesn't it? Memories, regrets, even the things we try to leave behind." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "I feel like I don't belong here anymore, like I'm just a visitor in my own past." Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. "You belong, Daniel. More than you realize." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and he turned to face her fully. The intensity in her gaze mirrored his own turmoil, a reflection of everything unspoken between them. The space between them felt charged, the rain blurring the lines between past and present, boundaries and possibilities. "I don't know how to move forward," he admitted, his voice trembling. "Not with him gone, not with everything left unresolved." Margaret stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his chest. "You don't have to figure it out alone. We can find a way forward together." The closeness between them was overwhelming, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. For a moment, Daniel thought he might drown in the depth of her gaze, in the weight of everything they had shared and everything they had yet to say. But then Margaret stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should go inside," she said softly, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "The rain's getting heavier." Daniel nodded, though his feet felt rooted to the ground. He watched her retreat toward the house, the light from the doorway casting a warm glow around her. He followed a moment later, his mind racing with questions and emotions he wasn't ready to confront. The rest of the night passed in a blur, the weight of their encounter lingering in the air like the scent of rain. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the garden glistening with dew and the house filled with an uneasy stillness. Daniel knew he couldn't stay forever, that he would have to leave and return to his life eventually. But for now he stayed, drawn by the pull of the past and the fragile hope of something more. And as he stood at the window watching the first rays of sunlight break through the clouds, he felt a glimmer of clarity, like the promise of a new beginning, waiting just beyond the horizon. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the conservatory, casting soft golden patterns across the floor. Daniel stood at the edge of the room, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The storm's residue lingered in the air, a faint smell of damp earth and lavender, but the house itself had grown eerily quiet. He had expected Margaret to be in the kitchen, as she often was in the mornings, but her absence only amplified the strange pull of their conversation the night before. He sipped his coffee absently, his gaze drifting to the garden where they had stood, inches apart, bound by something neither of them had dared to name. A soft creak broke the silence, and he turned to see Margaret entering the conservatory. She carried a tray of tea and scones, her movements as composed as ever, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment too long. "You're up early," she said, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. Her voice held its usual calm, but there was a thread of something unspoken woven through her words. "I couldn't sleep," Daniel replied, crossing the room to join her. "Too much on my mind." Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, her hands steady despite the tension that seemed to hum between them. "Last night was a lot to process," she admitted, her eyes focused on the delicate swirl of steam rising from her cup, the letters, the garden. It felt like opening a door that had been locked for years. Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. "It's like I'm seeing things differently now. The house, the memories, even you." Margaret's gaze flicked up to meet his, her expression unreadable. "And what do you see?" The question caught him off guard, and he hesitated, searching for the right words. "I see someone who's been holding everything together, even when it wasn't fair for her to carry the weight alone." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It wasn't about fairness. It was about survival. We all grieve in our own way, Daniel. Some of us just bury it deeper." Daniel set his coffee down, his hands restless as he leaned forward. "You don't have to keep burying it. Not with me." The vulnerability in his voice made her falter, and for a moment, the composure she wore like armor slipped. "I don't know how to do anything else," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of everything they had left unsaid. Daniel reached out instinctively, his hand brushing hers where it rested on the table. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a ripple through both of them. Margaret pulled her hand back slowly, her eyes searching his face. "This house has a way of trapping people in their memories," she said, changing the subject with deliberate precision. "It's easy to get lost in what was, instead of looking at what could be." Daniel didn't respond right away, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the emotions swirling between them. The tension was almost unbearable, like a taut string stretched to its limit, and he didn't know how much longer it could hold. "Maybe it's time to let some of those memories go," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "To make room for something new." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You sound so much like him when you say things like that." Her words were meant to be a compliment, but they landed with the weight of a revelation. Daniel leaned back, his hands tightening into fists. "I don't want to be like him," he said, his voice sharp. "I spent my whole life trying not to be." Margaret's face fell, and she reached out as if to comfort him, then stopped herself. "I didn't mean it that way," she said quietly. "You're not him, Daniel. You never were." Her reassurance should have soothed him, but instead it left him feeling more exposed. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air." Without waiting for her response, he left the conservatory, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The sunlight outside was warm on his face, but it did little to quell the storm brewing within him. He wandered aimlessly through the garden, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of emotions. He found himself back at the rose trellis, the same spot where they had stood the night before. The memory of Margaret's voice, her touch, her presence lingered like a ghost. He didn't know how to move forward, how to reconcile the past with the present, or how to navigate the uncharted waters of their connection. "You can't run from this forever." Her voice startled him, and he turned to see Margaret standing at the edge of the garden, her expression calm but resolute. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the damp grass. "I'm not running," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I just don't know what to do." Margaret stopped a few steps away, her eyes locked on his. "Neither do I. But maybe we don't have to figure it out all at once." The space between them felt electric, charged with the tension that had been building for days, years, even. Daniel took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What if we're making a mistake?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes mistakes are how we find the truth." Her words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Daniel searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was the same mixture of fear and hope that he felt. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, his hand reaching out to cup her face. The moment stretched into eternity, their breaths mingling in the stillness of the garden. But just as quickly as it began, Margaret pulled away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We can't," she said, her voice breaking. "Not like this." Daniel's hand fell to his side, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Margaret shook her head, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "Don't be. Whatever this is. It's just grief talking. We need time to heal, Daniel. Both of us." He nodded, though his heart ached with the finality of her words. "You're right." Margaret stepped back, her composure returning like a shield. "I think we should spend some time apart," she said softly. "You should go back to the city, focus on your life. And I'll stay here, figure out how to move forward." Daniel wanted to argue, to tell her that leaving wouldn't solve anything, but he knew she was right. The intensity of their connection had become too much, too fast, and they needed space to make sense of it. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'll go." Margaret gave him a small, bittersweet smile. "Thank you." As she turned and walked back toward the house, Daniel felt a hollow ache in his chest. The garden, once a place of solace, now felt like a battlefield littered with unspoken words and unfinished moments. He stayed outside until the sun began to set, the shadows lengthening around him. When he finally returned to the house, he found Margaret in the conservatory, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Take care of yourself," she said without looking at him. "You too," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. And with that, he left the house that had been both a sanctuary and a prison, carrying with him the weight of everything they had shared and everything they had left behind. Daniel sat in his car at the edge of the driveway, the house looming behind him in the rearview mirror like a monument to everything unresolved. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather smooth and worn beneath his fingertips. The engine idled, the hum filling the silence as he stared at the tree-lined road ahead. But he didn't move. The words Margaret had spoken echoed in his mind. "We need time to heal." He knew she was right, yet the truth of it felt like a blade twisting in his chest. Leaving wasn't just a matter of geography, it was a severing of something that had grown between them, something he hadn't fully understood but couldn't deny. With a deep breath, he put the car in gear and pulled onto the road. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the weight of it lingered, pressing against his chest as he drove. The winding roads leading back to the city were shrouded in twilight, the fading light casting long shadows across the asphalt. It felt fitting, as if the world itself mirrored the liminal space he found himself in. Back in his apartment, the city felt colder, emptier than he remembered. The usual noises, distant sirens, muted conversations from the street below, seemed muted, as though the world had turned down its volume. Daniel threw his bag onto the couch and stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do next. The days blurred together. Work became a lifeline, a distraction from the questions that churned in his mind. Yet, no matter how much he tried to lose himself in deadlines and meetings, his thoughts always circled back to Margaret. The letters, the garden, the tension that had passed between them like an unspoken promise, it all lingered unresolved. One evening, weeks later, he found himself staring at the framed photo on his desk. It was of him, his father, and Margaret, taken during a trip to the coast years ago. The three of them were smiling, the wind whipping through their hair. Margaret had her hand on his shoulder, touch so casual it hadn't registered at the time. Now it felt weighted with meaning. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Daniel hesitated before picking it up. "Hello, Daniel." Margaret's voice was soft, almost tentative. "I hope I'm not interrupting." His heart leapt at the sound of her voice. "Not at all. Is everything okay?" "I think so." There was a pause, filled with the quiet sound of her breathing. I wanted to check on you. See how you're doing." "I'm managing," he said, though the words felt like a half-truth. "What about you?" "Busy," she replied. "The garden's keeping me occupied. I started sorting through your father's things, finally." Daniel swallowed hard. "That can't be easy." "It's not," she admitted. "But it's necessary. He left behind so much. More than I realized." Her words carried layers he couldn't quite decipher. "Have you found anything unexpected?" Margaret hesitated. "A few things. Mostly reminders of who he was, both the man I loved and the one I struggled to understand." Daniel's chest tightened. "I wish I'd known him better." "So do I," she said quietly. "But I think part of him will always be a mystery. Maybe that's how he wanted it." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the sound of her voice wash over him. "I miss you," he said finally, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Margaret didn't respond right away. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I miss you too." The connection between them, fragile but undeniable, pulsed across the miles for the first time since leaving the house. Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I could come visit," he ventured. "Just for a weekend. To help with the garden or sorting through Dad's things." Margaret's breath hitched. "I'd like that." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Daniel's chest ache. For now, it was enough, a step toward something neither of them could fully define, but both were unwilling to let go of. As they said their goodbyes, Daniel stared out the window at the city lights, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and complications. But for the first time, he felt like they might be able to navigate it together. And that was all he needed. Daniel stood in the doorway of the conservatory, the pale morning light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. Margaret was still seated, her fingers lightly grazing the armrest of the chair, as if anchoring herself to the moment. Her hair was slightly mussed from the long night, and the faint lines beneath her eyes made her look achingly human, far removed from the composed woman he had grown up knowing. He hesitated, unsure whether to leave her in peace or to stay and bridge the silence that had settled between them. The air felt heavy with all that remained unspoken, but also strangely calm, like the world had paused, allowing them this fragile reprieve. "You're still here," she murmured without looking up, her voice soft, as though speaking any louder might shatter the moment. Daniel crossed the room slowly, the worn floorboards creaking under his weight. "Didn't seem right to leave," he admitted. "Not after everything." Margaret gave a faint smile, her gaze still fixed on the garden beyond the glass. The storm had passed, leaving the earth glistening and fresh, though the roses looked battered from the rain. "Funny," she said. "I always thought storms would tear everything apart. But they just rearrange things." Her words hung in the air, sinking into Daniel like a revelation. She wasn't just talking about the weather. He followed her gaze to the garden, to the chaos of petals scattered on the soil, and nodded. Maybe that's what we needed. Margaret finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes soft. "You mean you and me?" she asked quietly. Daniel felt his pulse quicken at the question, but he held her gaze. "I mean all of it. This house, Dad, you me. It's all been rearranged. But maybe that's not the worst thing." She studied him for a long moment, her silence filled with thoughts she didn't voice. "I keep wondering what he'd think," she said finally. "If he were here now. If he'd see what we've become without him." "I think he'd want us to figure it out," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he expected. "For ourselves." Margaret looked away, blinking quickly as if brushing off the weight of her emotions. "You're more like him than you realize," she said. "But not in the ways you fear." The words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. For years, he'd tried to escape the shadow of his father, only to find that parts of him were inescapable. Yet Margaret's voice carried no judgment, only quiet reassurance. As the morning unfolded, they lingered in the conservatory, sharing fragments of memories and stories about the man who had bound their lives together. The tension between them began to ease, replaced by something softer, something that felt like healing. Later, they worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds and staking the roses that had weathered the storm. The physical labor was grounding, giving their hands something to do while their thoughts drifted. Margaret's laughter came unexpectedly when Daniel slipped in the mud, and he found himself grinning despite the dirt streaked across his shirt. For the first time in weeks, the house felt alive, not just with movement but with purpose. The air between them was no longer heavy with grief, but tinged with something that felt like hope. As the day stretched on, they found themselves back in the kitchen, sharing a quiet meal. Margaret poured them each a glass of wine, the ruby liquid catching the light as she raised her glass. "To surviving the storm," she said with a small smile. Daniel clinked his glass against hers. "To what comes after." The clinking of their glasses felt like a quiet promise, a commitment to the future, whatever it might hold. They drank in silence, the weight of the past loosening its grip just a little more with each sip. By the time night fell, Daniel found himself sitting alone in the study, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. Margaret had gone upstairs, her footsteps light but steady on the old wooden stairs. He stared at the letters spread out on the desk, his father's words now familiar but no less impactful. One letter in particular caught his eye. It wasn't addressed to Margaret but to him, a letter he hadn't noticed in the pile before. With trembling hands, he unfolded it, the creases soft and worn from time. "My son," it began. Daniel's heart thudded as he read. The words weren't flowery or poetic. They were honest, raw in a way his father had never been in life. He wrote about his fears, his regrets, and most of all, his love, a love that had always been there, even when it hadn't been easy to show. The letter ended simply, "Take care of her. She's stronger than she seems, but even the strongest need someone to lean on. And if you ever feel lost, remember, storms rearrange, but they also renew." Daniel folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. His father's words echoed in his mind as he sat back in the chair, staring at the flames dancing in the hearth. Upstairs, Margaret's light was still on, casting a soft glow into the hallway. He didn't knock, didn't dare disturb her, but he stood outside her door for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of her movements. "Good night, Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Inside, the light clicked off, and the house settled into stillness. Daniel turned away, heading for his room. For the first time in what felt like years, he slept deeply, his dreams free of the shadows that had haunted him for so long. In the days and weeks that followed, life found a new rhythm. Daniel began to feel less like a visitor and more like a part of the house, of the life Margaret was rebuilding. They didn't talk much about the night of the storm or the letters, but the unspoken understanding between them grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't perfect, grief rarely was, but it was real. And as the roses in the garden began to bloom again, Daniel realized that sometimes rearrangement was exactly what was needed for something beautiful to grow.